Talking Journeys of Belonging to Blackness with your host, India Lorick Wilmot.
Who lived in Brooklyn?
Season 5. Welcome to another episode for Season 5. With us today are co-founders and leaders of Unknown Project. It is a Louisville, Kentucky artist-run nonprofit collaborative of Ideas Lab, whose mission is to use art to unearth the names, stories, histories, and experiences of U.S. enslaved African descendants in order to support racial healing and reconciliation. Hannah Drake is a poet, author, co-founder, and chief creative officer of Unknown Project. Hannah's writings have garnered editorial attention from the Washington Post and the New York Times, and of celebrity influencers Colin Kaepernick and Ava DuVernay. A social justice advocate and organizer around issues of race, feminism, and politics, Hannah has received several recognitions, including Today's Women magazine's Most Admired Woman in the Arts, the Kentucky Colonel Award from Kentucky's governor, and was inducted into the Kentucky Women Remembered exhibit, which is a permanent display in the state capitol that honors exceptional women and their contributions to the state of Kentucky. Josh Miller is co-founder and chief executive officer of Ideas Lab and co-founder of Unknown Project. A queer changemaker, public speaker, and photographer, Josh's work has been featured and supported by the New York Times, the Aspen Institute, and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. He is the recipient of numerous awards and recognitions, including Business Equality Magazine's 40 LGBTQ+ Leaders Under 40 and Louisville Business First's 40 Under 40, and fellowships from the Colorado Collective Leadership Initiative, CBCA Leadership Arts, and the National Leadership Academy for the Public's Health. Since its founding in 2020, the Unknown Project has exhumed and reclaimed over 800 names of enslaved people and created and displayed public art installations, and immersive experiences throughout Kentucky. They have received funding and recognition from the National Endowment for the Arts, the Ford Foundation, the Mellon Foundation, and have several partnerships, including with Roots 101, the Fraser History Museum, and Louisville Metro, just to name a few. In June 2021, Unknown Project unveiled the long-awaited and highly anticipated public artwork installation along the Ohio River entitled On the Banks of Freedom, to memorialize Black people whose names and stories would have otherwise been lost in history. In 2022, Hannah and Josh were both named Open Society Foundation Soros Equality Fellows to expand Unknown Project to a national initiative. Welcome, Hannah and Josh, founders of Unknown Project.
Thank you for having us.
Thrilled to be here this morning.
We have a lot of ground to cover, so are you both ready?
Yes.
Let's do it.
All right, let's get into it.
Give Black Alliance is proud to support the podcast Talking Journeys of Belonging to Blackness, hosted by India Lorick Wilmot. The podcast is an exploration of all aspects of our Black communities, including gifts of time, talent, and treasure, while shedding a positive light on the African descendant experience globally. The Give Black Alliance informs, reforms, and transforms philanthropy to acknowledge and partner with our communities in order to bring about equitable change for all. To learn more about Give Black Alliance, visit us at giveblackalliance.org.
Right about now.
Act 1, Call to Adventure.
This is a breakdown.
Hannah and Josh, so before diving deep into your collaboration and works through Unknown Project, I think it's always important to briefly give our listeners some context as to who you are individually as both creatives and artists, and how you show up in this social justice work together. So if you each could, can you briefly describe how your family life and lived experiences to date have inspired your personal and professional endeavors today?
I am a writer, a poet, and I never really wrote like love poems and stuff. It was always about social justice and being Black in America. I always loved words and writing. It just made sense to me. I wasn't great at math. I was always really good at writing, and my mom taught me how to read when I was 3 years old. So I always loved reading. I just felt like I had something to say to the world about everything going on around me. And that's really when I started writing about injustice and the wrongs that we see in the world. And I think it's the reason I was put on this earth.
In terms of my background, I'm the oldest of 5 siblings, and I grew up in the Chattanooga, Tennessee area. I was homeschooled up until 10th grade. And then I was in a very religious, conservative community. And so after I was outed for being gay before my junior year, I then moved in with family in Southern Indiana my senior year. And my formative 0 to 18 years very much were in a bubble where I did not have any understanding of the history of enslavement. That isn't something that was taught, really, the history of the US in that type of depth, or an understanding of the prevalence of racism in the US. And so moving to Louisville, Kentucky, and beginning the work with my now husband, Theo Edmonds, and then, of course, with Hannah, with Roots and Wings, with collaborators in Smoketown, has really shifted my understanding of the importance of history. How do we collectively use our art? I'm a photographer, I do storytelling and writing. How do we engage people in that journey as a way to support all the different things that communities want, and think about how we can facilitate healing and reconciliation as part of our journey? So those have been just some of the facets that have kind of fed into my curiosity, my empathy, and my wanting to collaborate to change and improve what the future looks like for our communities.
And so, with any significant project and collaboration, there's always an origin story. Given that you both are from different locations, in terms of the Unknown Project, what was the impetus for its founding? Like, how did you both meet? What events or activities inspired your collaboration? How does this come together, particularly for this very specific kind of project for folks?
I believe Josh and I met, maybe it was 2015. His now husband started a group or helped form a group called Roots and Wings, which was a group of artists. And they were doing a Smoketown poetry opera. Smoketown is a neighborhood in Louisville. It's the oldest continuous African-American neighborhood in Louisville that was founded by formerly enslaved people. And it just so happens to be where my family is from. For 4 generations, my family lived in Smoketown, and they needed a poet for this group. They called me to be a part of this group. So that's how Josh and I met. I never imagined, I don't even know if you imagined, Josh, that Josh and I would be at this point. But during that group, we were all traveling to Senegal to connect West Africa to Appalachia. And I think that, for me at least, started this journey to the Unknown Project. We were there for 2 weeks and went to Goree Island. And I just wanted to know what the other side of enslavement looked like in America. Outside of the very short teachings in school, I was just very curious. When I stood in the door of no return and looked out at the water, what did that look like in America? And in my mind, I knew I was going to have to travel south. I wasn't even thinking about Kentucky. I just knew I was going to have to go deep south. And Josh, you can just pick up there because Josh and Theo were working in Mississippi as life would have it. And so that's how I ended up visiting Mississippi several times.
When we launched Ideas X Lab, which is the nonprofit that Unknown Project has been birthed through, it was based in Louisville, Kentucky, which is also where Humana is based, the health insurer. And so what we were really looking at broadly for the organization is how can artists, with all of their creative potential and the different ways that they approach problems, that they create solutions together. How can artists be catalysts in community change and in change with corporations? And so it was actually Humana inviting us and engaging us to work with them on a project in Natchez, Mississippi, that took us down there to begin with. That was a smaller kind of prototype project. And then we ended up partnering with community members in Natchez to apply for a National Endowment for the Arts grant. And Natchez is where the second largest market of enslaved people in the South was. And so as we loaded in the car and drove down to Natchez, we were touring their African American Museum. And on the wall is a map that shows all of these routes of how enslaved people were trafficked in the US. And it showed the Ohio River and it showed Kentucky. And so that was one of those moments that just reiterated the history of Kentucky that's so often downplayed when it comes to the role that Kentucky played in enslavement and in the slave trade. And so, like Hannah was saying, it's been this journey of not only the work in Smoketown, which Hannah mentioned, the oldest continuous African American neighborhood in Kentucky, but also going to Senegal, going to Natchez, going to New Orleans together, that's brought forward all of these different ways of understanding history and community and what has been hidden, but also then provided opportunities for us as individuals, as artists, each on our own journey of evolving and kind of questioning the things that we maybe were brought up knowing or understanding more about ourselves, to do that in a collaborative way that also came with building a lot of trust. And so I think it's been the ability to be on that journey together that then has allowed Hannah and I to work together in the way that we do, especially on a project like one focused so heavily on enslavement.
I love this. I'm always interested in the impetus or the origin story, because I think in both of your retellings, there were so many touch points, various trips, your own lived experiences that you already carry that you bring into the context and the situation, going to Senegal, going down to Mississippi, going to these different museums and speaking with other people who have family histories, who are also engaged in some genealogical process. What were some of the things that you were putting together just before Unknown Project? It's in that nebulous that I'm trying to get at.
One part that was huge for me was going to Montgomery, Alabama. So my daughter and I went to the National Memorial Peace and Justice when it opened. But before, a friend and now a partner of ours from the Fraser, Rachel Platt, had asked me, did I know a couple named Thornton and Lucy Blackburn? And I didn't know who this couple was, but they were enslaved in Louisville and escaped to Canada. And they wanted to do something at the museum around this couple. And I told her, when I come back, we'll talk about it, but I'm going with my daughter to Alabama. My daughter and I were driving to Alabama, and I was determined to take a picture of every pillar from Kentucky. So they have the names of people that were lynched. And in order to be in this museum, your state had to lynch over 100 people. And Kentucky is in that museum. And Kentucky lynched 169 people that they know of. 8 of those people were listed as unknown. And I was just so curious who they were. And so when I came back, I think all the touch points we discussed, but particularly going to Montgomery and seeing that word unknown just stayed with me, because I just don't think it's right that somebody existed and history erased them. I think for me, that was one of the themes throughout all of our travels, that Black people were simply erased from history. They were covered up, they tore down where enslaved people lived, bricked them over, made offices out of them. They don't know their names. They listed Black people as Negro gal, didn't even have names, just ages. And I just thought that was so unfair, that that is how Black people were being recorded. And how can that be? And surely those names are out there somewhere. Somebody has them. And I'm just a firm believer, nobody's unknown. They're hidden. They're just hidden. And how can we start finding people? And for me, that's the biggest theme that I have found, is America has worked extremely hard at burying Black history and Black people.
I think for me, The trip to Senegal was really transformative. It's one thing to believe in the importance of racial equity and injustice and to imagine what that difference could look like in the lives of people that we love, like Hannah, like her daughter Brianna, like the artists and community members that we collaborate with. And it is totally different to witness for 2 weeks Hannah and the artists of Roots and Wings being in a place where being Black was the norm and where they, in many senses, could feel free and feel joyful in a different way and less stress. And Hannah talks about one time going to a shop and someone might, like in the US, assume she is stealing something. And the shop owner's outside. Like the shop owner doesn't care that Hannah's in there. To witness that, the potential of what they could be without being surrounded by white supremacy all the time, is different than imagining. And so one of the things that Hannah said before we came back to Theo and I, because we were the only two white people on the trip, was now that you've been here to experience this, it is your job to carry it back. And I think at that time, my understanding of what that job was to just carry back the story of what we experienced in Africa, how that may have been different than what we see in the media, all of these different facets of the history that we learned about. But I think as our work together progressed and had all of these different touch points and we created Unknown Project, the bringing of it back is really how do we support the reality of an imagining of a world where racial equity is a reality. For me, I couldn't come back from a trip like that and that experience and seeing what was possible and then be like, well, that was cute for 2 weeks, but I got to focus on other things. And so that became an underlying current of there's responsibility that I and we as white community members have in this work. It isn't just on Black people to fix what white people broke and the horrific things that they did and have now tried to erase.
I appreciate that both of you are also artists. Unknown Project uses art installations and immersive experiences to tell a fuller and even more accurate account of U.S. history of enslavement and its legacy today. What has been your approach to capturing these varied narratives and stories? Are there particular stories or frames you encourage artists to tell in their works?
So I think as we have engaged different artists through Unknown Project, you mentioned On the Banks of Freedom earlier, and we did a public call for artists. We had community artists involved in the selection process. So William Duffy was the lead artist selected, and then he engaged a collaborator named Dave Cottle. And what we really encouraged was please go and do historical research, but also create opportunities in your process for the community to participate. So we had sessions where we talked to artists in the community, where we engaged with middle school students and students in the public school system and different community members, because we really have seen throughout our different projects when community has a role in the creation and what inspires the works, then they also have more ownership and pride in what is created and what is in their community. And that's a really important facet for us. So it was an intersection of here are the themes of Unknown Project, this focus on unearthing the enslaved narratives and these stories and prioritizing as well names of enslaved people, but also in each facet working to build in that community engagement piece so that voice and that collaboration is there no matter what type of project we're working on. Starting in 2020 and inspired in part by our trip to Senegal and taking the ferry to Gorée Island, we commissioned the creation of the Journeys to Freedom River Cruise. And so that followed an iterative process as well, where Sydney Monroe Williams, who was the writer and director, did research, but then created all of these opportunities for the community to participate in and give feedback on the process. And that's something that we found to be really powerful in terms of engaging people in this history and using these different types of art as a way to continue to spotlight these facets of Unknown Project.
So I think it'd be helpful if we dig in deep in terms of the 2021 memorial on the Banks of Freedom. So there's this whole other thing in terms of what you all are doing using art for Unknown Project, right? And engaging the community and capturing their perspectives. And then you also have the space of why it's important to memorialize these stories, these voices, in the framework of people also feeling some type of way about the existence of memorials and whose stories are being represented, especially in terms of if this memorial is going to last 100 years, what are people going to be thinking about on the banks of freedom 100 years from now? So if you could explain that journey and what this all means in that context.
We started planning 2018-19. We really started planning, making on the banks of freedom. And then 2020 happened, which was COVID, of course. But in Louisville, Breonna Taylor was killed by the Louisville Metro Police Department. It just so happened she was killed the day the state really shut down for COVID. There was no way that that happened in the city and I wasn't going to be outside in the street. I was going to be protesting and screaming for justice for Breonna. And so you have this tragedy coupled with trying to give this city something about race, gift the city this memorial for enslaved people. So you have these two things clashing in my mind. And also in this city that removed during that time we were protesting Confederate statue that had been up for over 100 years. So this memorial is going down and we're creating this memorial for enslaved people on the banks of the Ohio River, which many people had no idea that the Ohio was the dividing line to freedom, that many enslaved people had to cross the Ohio to get to Indiana. They just didn't know the history. They didn't know that Kentucky enslaved 250,000 people, that Kentucky sold 80,000 of those people down south. What I have learned from doing this is that people simply just don't know the history. It's just been hidden. I believe, and I told people this when they took down the Confederate statue, when I stood in that space and recited poetry, what you put in a space, public art wise, can transform the entire community and can transform a city. So put something in the space where people feel welcome, where people feel included, where people feel it's okay to ask questions, where people can learn something. And I think we've done that with On the Banks of Freedom. I think it's a spot where people can reflect. I think it's a spot where people can learn, where there can be reconciliation. We've had people come to the spot and bring names of people that their family did, in fact, enslave. I think it's like a gateway. It's a doorway to ignite a conversation, to at least start on a pathway to change. I feel good that we've done that in this city that surely needs it. When I think about Breonna Taylor and I think about what we are doing, finding these names, it's the very same thing they did to Breonna. Because when Breonna was murdered, no one ever said her name. She was just, oh, someone was killed. Well, who? A Black woman. Well, what Black woman? Well, a 26-year-old Black woman. Well, what was her name? And then finally, months later, it was Breonna Taylor, and her name became known all around the world. But it took people exhuming her name for it to be known. It's the same thing with enslaved people. It's taking not just Josh and I, but many people to exhume these names and say these people were here. They existed. Same exact thing. And America just continues to repeat the same thing over and over again. And I hope one day we get the lesson.
I think that's the wonderful thing about art as a medium. It's not only your sweet spot for you individually, but art is both a reflection of our current state and our humanity in many ways, but then also it's an opportunity. Art as a medium is an opportunity to provoke thoughts and hopes and expressions of fears and all the ranges of human emotions that we might have. And it's an invitation to have a discussion or engagement about it. Public art and the immersive experiences of these installations engage folks in these conversations that people aren't having. And hopefully in 100 years, people will look to the art as an invitation to have conversation.
Be what you want to see.
Act 2, The Road.
Josh and Hannah, as with many creatives, we are multifaceted. We work across various mediums and contexts to fulfill our life's purpose, to express that thing that's inside. So, how has your work with Unknown Project impacted your own personal and creative projects?
The way that Unknown Project has impacted my work in part has been in addition to photography, am also a runner and I do a lot of outdoor exploration. And part of what we've been finding across different areas are unmarked cemeteries and different spaces that are ones we may pass in our daily lives, but may overlook, or historical markers along different places that we're visiting that we may not have prioritized stopping to actually engage with before. And so part of Unknown Project has really made me more aware of the spaces that we move through and the history that was there, seeking to far better understand that. And from a storytelling perspective, it has encouraged being more strategic in terms of understanding that Hannah and I each have different audiences who can receive information from us in different ways. And because of the different types of artistic practices that we have, there is an ability to use those to share messaging in ways that can be received differently. Learning, especially over the past probably 5 years, how we can be in conversation together to think about the different ways that we reach the networks that we are a part of and have access to through the art that we're creating. I would say those are two of the ways that it is kind of evolving the way that I think about work personally. And like I said earlier, it has just continued to reiterate the value of community participation. Hannah said earlier, like it hasn't just been the two of us. There have been organizational partners, community members and leaders, artists, Metro government has been involved. And so it's really been this collective of people with an artistic vision that has been a unifier.
And I would agree with everything that Josh said. I think for me with the Unknown Project, one thing that has certainly shifted with me is I feel as if I have nothing to lose at this point. The more I learn about enslavement and the horror of it, I'm just going for broke with this project because the things I have learned are heartbreaking. It's soul wrenching sometimes to look back in history and see everything that Black people had to endure. I think for sure, as an artist and working with artists and doing this particular work, I think it is extremely important for us to take care of the artists that we engage and for us, the co-lead artists, to take time for ourselves because it's difficult work. Some of the stories are so horrific that sometimes I have to put the book down because I just can't believe that another human being was treated in such a manner. Sometimes I have to step away from it because it is extremely, extremely painful work. But I feel it's necessary work. It's my job to hold up a mirror to America and say, this is what you have done, and we will not forget it. Certainly, in doing this project, I never imagined in a million years that I would find my family. I wrote this poem, Finding Me, before we even thought about the Unknown Project. And my friend said it was like you wrote the project into existence because I was just looking for my family. I didn't know any of my ancestors. All my grandparents have passed away. My father has passed away. My mom is still living, but she's in her 70s and she could only remember her grandmother and she couldn't remember her name. She said that they just called her Mamie. And in doing this project, which was written about in the New York Times, someone read that. It was only 2 sentences, and I talked about not being able to trace my family. A woman who was named Dana, who's now my friend, traced my family for me and found my mother's grandmother, which would be my great grandmother. And she was born into slavery and lived to be 100. and is buried in Grand Rapids, Michigan. So I will be going to her gravesite to leave her flowers. And of course, it led me to you, India, and going to Lexington, South Carolina, where my great, great, great grandparents were enslaved, to find out that my great, great, great grandmother's name was Hannah. And it was as if she was just calling me to come find her. And I found out, Dana told me, well, she was enslaved in Lexington, South Carolina, and they moved her. And I said, well, where did they move her to? She said they moved her to Mississippi, where you visited. So it was like I was always following her around the country. And the last line of that poem says, in finding you, I found me. So it led me right to you, cuz. No.
I love it. I love it. I think research is hard, especially when there's a lot of intentionality in the historical record to not include people. The act of omission is a powerful way to silence. But I appreciate you being reflective, Hannah, in terms of there's also joy in the story, that it's not always negative in the sense of, yes, people may experience trauma, inhumanity, but you on the other side of that, how many generations out are able to still look to the historical record and to discover people and to celebrate them in whatever way that you find most meaningful, right? And giving them name is a celebration. It's like another birthday. There's a rebirth that's happening in ways that's more humane, given that there's silence in the historical record. So I appreciate you sharing that part as well as the journey and how that's impacted you. As an interracial partnership, co-founders, how has race and ethnicity informed your work with the Unknown Project? As I was doing some background recon, perhaps it was you, Josh, that may have been quoted someplace in saying that through the project, it's about inviting white people to acknowledge the possible role their family played in enslaving Black people. With that being said, are you finding when people see the two of you as the co-founders, is there resistance? Are folks accusing you both of essentially of race baiting or triggering of white guilt? And I say that particularly with the recent and very profound effort to rewrite and to whitewash US history.
Often, no matter the context I meet people in, they ask, oh, what are you working on? And I say, well, Hannah and I are working on an Unknown Project, and this is what it is. And then they may look at me for a minute and they're like, so why are you doing this project? Why are you involved in this? That is one of the most frequent questions.
Why are people asking that?
I think they may not see or understand, maybe from their lived experience, what role a white person has in this work. They may be coming from a place of not wanting to address this history or not being comfortable talking about this history. You know, when people look at me, I'm white, I'm queer, I'm very androgynous. So I think there's just a lot of different assumptions that are made about the type of person and the type of work that I might be interested in. Hannah, I remember when she wrote that poem, when she created an installation and she looked back at who were these different enslaved Hannahs, not even knowing that her great-great-grandmother's name was also Hannah. And so there's so many of these different pieces that are tied together in terms of the freedom that we can get from this true accounting of history and just having that understanding that I think is really important. Part of how that has played out interpersonally, and I mentioned earlier that the earned trust between us that has built over years is that we have gotten to a place of really being able to talk about and unpack different things that we are each experiencing, whether it's an unintended negative consequence from the project, or if people look at the leadership of this project and they're going to attack someone, it's going to be Hannah. They see a Black woman, they are going to attack Hannah. And so part of how I can be supportive is seeking to understand where that is coming from, but also how we can put different processes in place to mitigate the negative impact. Like Hannah talked about, the rest and recovery piece. And so as a collective, being cognizant of those different dynamics that are at play, and then also recognizing this group may be able to hear about Unknown Project and may be invited into it because I'm asking, while this group over here may be invited more in because Hannah's asking. And so that becomes part of how do we most strategically invite people into this. And like you were saying, calling on the descendants of enslavers, not to say we think in 2023 that you enslaved people, but to say you may have information that helps someone find their ancestors, helps us understand this history of place differently, of culture and community differently, not to say the current people holding the information were condemning you, but to say you in sharing this are helping to create a different kind of accounting and community.
I certainly would agree with Josh. And I also think when people enter the space of the project or learn about the project, they immediately understand the importance of recognizing that someone was here. But America is America. So I will get hate mail or accused of race baiting. You know, what people need to understand is history is history. It happened and we can't erase it. We can't erase it. We can't hide it. I know a lot of people want to do that, but it happened. And in order for Kentucky to be any better, you have to face it. You simply are going to have to face it. There is no getting around it. Not just Kentucky, but America. You are going to have to face what you've done. You cannot enslave people for hundreds of years and Jim Crow and black codes and mass incarceration and everything else and believe that you will not have to atone for that. You will not have to face that. And I'm so thankful. This project is just a little stepping stone for people to do that. And I tell people all the time, you are carrying guilt. They're ashamed of what their family did. And they're ashamed of what white people did in America. So they don't want to talk about it. But you don't change or grow from shame. You change and grow from facing the truth. That's how we get better, facing the reality of what happened in this state. That's the only way it will get better. And if I have to continue to hold up a mirror, that's what I'm going to do. Morrison said the function of racism is distraction, and I can't be distracted. This is the journey that I'm on.
Do you think it's in part an issue around reparations as to why folks don't want to acknowledge? Because I always get the sense that people can acknowledge to a certain extent. Like, okay, fine, slavery did exist in the United States. Somehow African descendant people got to this shore. Apparently, slavery was a great thing that taught life skills and, and other kinds of skills. If there's any sort of admission to say, I didn't enslave, my immediate family didn't enslave, but we are benefactors not only to perhaps actual enslavement, but benefactors to the system of white supremacy that even if I wasn't directly in there or my family weren't, I benefited from. Because no one wants to then say, well, what do we then owe you?
It's that I feel at the core of it, it is so close that it is difficult for people to admit. That was my granddad that did that. That was my great granddad that did that. And then you have to look at yourself and say, oh, wait a minute. I'm not the victor in the story of America. I'm the villain. That doesn't feel good. And that's hard to admit. When people talk about the Holocaust and fighting the war, they can feel proud. They're proud of that. But there is no honor in what happened in America. There is no honor to say my great granddad, my great 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 grandmother enslaved people and brutalized people, because I am learning when you think about things that are passed down in your family, now you have to look at you. What could be brewing in you? And that doesn't feel good and you're ashamed. And so you want to hide it and pretend that it doesn't exist in your family. It's like a family secret. You know, I was talking to one woman once and she told me about pictures of a lynching. Where did you find these pictures? Hidden in my grandmother's Bible. You see, this is the reality of what's passed down in families, that you have to look at your grandmother now and know that your grandmother is hiding pictures of a lynching. And now how do you square that with the grandma that bakes pies and cakes? That's difficult to square that up. And that's the part that I believe many people in America don't want to face.
Yeah, Hannah, I agree with that. And another facet we can recognize that slavery existed, but full stop. Once we start to delve into the true horror of it, we also then are reckoning with the prevalence of racism, all of the systems that exist that are grounded in racism, and the question of privilege. And in reality, a wholesale change that we need across every area of life. And for many people, I think that as a concept to them is so intimidating and grounded in fear of change and of the unknown that they'd rather full stop not deal with it, period, rather than recognize that we have to move through it and have a plan for how do we create these systems level change so that as an entire society we are moving forward. And so there's that family and interpersonal piece, and then also that systemic piece, and both of those are at play in terms of why so many facets of our communities are resistant to engaging with it at all.
As co-founders, it would seem that both of you are also operating as proxies for one another, in the sense that for Hannah, you were talking about receiving hate mail, or that even though you're both co-founders and there's a whole slew of other people who contribute and support the project, you as a Black woman gets targeted. And to invite other people to the space, Josh is a white proxy to engage this other body to introduce them to the project. I get it as a strategy, but that must be very hard because there's always, I think, a tension around who has the authority to speak on what. But then we also know that collaboration is necessary too. Josh, you were talking about it. I thought that's interesting as a strategy, and I get it. But I wonder if that serves as a challenge or an opportunity, or is it sort of in the sweet spot of being both?
I think it's the sweet spot of being both. Josh and I have learned, like you said, to work with each other in this level of trust. Even in doing research, and I'm just strongly pro-Black, this does not change without white people. It's just not going to change. We are going to have to work together. That is how it will change. So funny. I saw a TikTok, this young girl in Appalachia, and she said, the more I sit and think about it, a lot of our issues are the issues that Black people have. And I said, well, my God, the light bulb just clicked. Because the things you are fighting for and that you want are the very same things that Black people want. And we aren't that different. But you are convinced, people have convinced you that I'm the one as a Black person that's hindering you as a white person in Appalachia. And I'm not. We need to work together in order to change these systems that are hurting both of us. We're not winning fighting against each other. And they know that. And that's why it has worked for so many years. And so I work constantly trying to get many white people to see in my community, if you were to just stand with Black people, your entire life could change. And people are seeing that now. Oh, wait a minute. You meant my rights too. Yeah, they just came at Black people first, but they meant you too. You may as well just get over here with me, because we're all fighting this uphill battle. One thing I have learned with Unknown Project is that Josh, as a white man and white people, you have a role in this because we did not create this. And so you have a role in helping us to fix this. You have a role in helping us to tell this story. You have a role in contributing to this project as a white person. This is your story as well. You are entering it at a different point than enslavement, but you need to go back and look at your family. Anytime people ask, well, Hannah, how do I find out if my family enslaved people? I said, go talk to the oldest person in your family. Go shake a few leaves in your family tree and see what you find, because you just may be surprised what comes out of those leaves. That's why I encourage white people to enter this space. And even if you say, oh, my family never enslaved, well, how are you benefiting? How are you benefiting from these systems? So I think Josh and I working together pulls both of these groups of people to really look at all of those things. But enslavement isn't just the story of Black people. It is the story of America.
To build on what Hannah was saying, as a team, we are regularly in communication. And part of that is around people who approach the project or may reach out to us individually without including the other person, both about Unknown Project. And so we're constantly examining how we are setting expectations of how to communicate with us as a team, and where is the balance of when we handle it one-on-one, how do we stay looped in? So that's a loop that we are constantly checking in on and thinking about. It's been interesting to see people's varying comfort levels with how they enter or how they share information back with the project. Some, in terms of descendants of enslavers, have just sent Hannah a DM on Twitter or emailed us. But some individuals we've engaged with for a year or two around Unknown Project, and then it'll be a side conversation with someone at an event. And I'm like, oh yeah, we're about to go to this place for Unknown Project. And this is someone who we've talked to about the project a variety of times. And they said, oh, well, my family enslaved people there. And it took this whole arc of relationship building and helping them to understand the values and the focus of Unknown Project for them to step into that conversation to share that. So it's been really interesting because of how we can be perceived individually and then together, how we manage that as a collaborative from a clear communication standpoint so that we can carry the work forward in a way that we think embodies what its values are. And then also accepting the different ways that people enter into it with us and then having that invitation to participate.
So, in terms of Unknown Project and the work that has been done thus far in Kentucky, and then even nationally as you work to expand its impact, what do you want its legacy to be?
I hope that the Unknown Project certainly lives on well beyond us, and for people to understand that everybody deserves to be remembered. Everybody deserves to be acknowledged. Everyone has contributed to the building of America when it comes to enslaved people, and to stop burying names and stories and history because you feel ashamed of the story. All of those stories and names together will make America better.
Yeah, I agree with Hannah. And I think as we're expanding Unknown Project, part of the vision is having sites in every state, getting back to how interconnected the history of enslavement is with the history of this nation. Places for the invitation to participate, this recognition and honoring of collective memory, and that all of these lives and these people who have names were part of building all of these communities, creating spaces for the memory and the celebration of those lives, whether or not we know the names of those people. Just like you were saying earlier, in 100 years, when they go to an Unknown Project site, finding entryways into these conversations and into understanding that history differently.
Get involved.
Act 3, Where We Land. All right, Josh, Hannah, we have come to the end of our program. And usually at this time, I ask if you both can share any upcoming public art exhibits, installations, events that people can learn more about. And if you can share what your website and social media handles where they can learn more, that would be fantastic.
As we look at 2024 and the growth of Unknown Project, we'll be offering our public art experience at On the Banks of Freedom. We'll be collaborating with some community partners to unveil new Unknown Project sites in different locations, and continuing to engage people in unearthing this history and these names. So we invite people to go to unknownprojecttrail.com. That's where you can check out all of the current experiences, the exhibits, the public art installations. If there are events available, they will be on there as well. And then you can visit the trail page look at the names that have been unearthed, looked at the locations and the unknown project sites, and also contribute your own information, whether it's a plantation, a cemetery, or different locations connected to the lives of enslaved people. We really invite you to join us in this journey and help to build out and share all of these different facets of the history connected to enslavement in the U.S. and beyond.
All right, there you have it, folks. Well, Hannah Drake and Josh Miller, thank you so much. Thank you, Unknown Project.
Thank you for having us.
The journey isn't over, but this episode is. To catch the latest, be sure to subscribe to the podcast and follow us on Instagram at journeysb2b_podcast. Thanks for listening.